Hello, and welcome to Week 2, Lesson 5 for ELA Grade 12. I will be walking you through the distance learning lesson for the day. A quick overview before we get started. I am going to start off by talking about the resources and materials that you'll need for the lesson. I'll give you a brief overview of the learning. I'll do some modeling of the reading, thinking, speaking, and writing that you'll be doing today. And then I'll leave you with a preview of some of the learning for the upcoming lessons. So let's go ahead and get started. We are going to start something new today and start off with a riddle of the day. So if you'd like to gather your family member or caregiver around the screen and they can be a thought partner for you, you're welcome to do that now. I will read this aloud while you follow along on your screen. I am an odd number. Take away a letter and I become even. What number am I? Read it again to yourself if you need to. And if you want to pause the video if you're still thinking, go ahead and do that now because I'm about to show you the answer, which is 7. 7, of course, is an odd number, and if you take away that first letter S, it becomes the word even. Okay, so that was just something quick to get our wheels turning. And now we are going to jump into lesson 5, which can be found on page 21 of your learning packet. You'll also need today your note catcher, which is on page 22. And of course, you'll need something to write with. And today we are going to start a new text. We are going to be reading A Changing World this week, and this can be found on pages 17 through 20 of your packet. Here is our learning target for the day, and go ahead and read this one with me. Ready? I can read a text and make connections to the essential question of the unit. So we are going to start reading the text today by doing a first read of some of the sections, and then you'll be making connections to the essential question of the unit. And what exactly is our essential question? So we're going to find out here. So our text for the next few lessons is called A Changing World, and it is an informative text. And the reason we're reading it is to expand our background knowledge about the British colonial era. These lessons on British history will help give us some context on some key events that happened during that time period, and that's going to help us understand some of the other texts that we read over the next several weeks. So as we read over the next few lessons, there are two guiding questions that we'll be thinking about and revisiting throughout our lessons. First, how did British colonialism complicate the idea of home? So we'll learn about British soldiers going into other countries and colonizing them, building their empire in the process. How might this have complicated the idea of home for British citizens who stayed in Britain, for the British soldiers who were forced to create new homes in the countries that they colonized, and also for the citizens of the countries that the British took over? So how did all of this, how did the colonialism complicate the idea of home for these different populations? Think about this while you're reading the text this week. Another question to think about is how do the key events during this time period relate to finding a home? In particular, how did this era complicate perceptions of home, and what do you think about whether a person can feel at home in a country where they are seen as different or not belonging? So these are the questions that we'll be revisiting throughout the next few lessons. What you'll be reading today as you think about these questions are pages 17 through the top of page 19 in your packet. And these sections are listed on the screen here, and I'll go ahead and read them for you as well. So you'll start with page 17, reading the Voices of the Period section, and then you'll move into the History of the Period section, and you'll read the first 3 subsections: the Victorian Era, An Empire Won, and A War to End All Wars. And A War to End All Wars is the last section for today, and that'll end on page 19. Since this is our first reading of the text, we're going to be doing our usual first reading annotations, which you can see on the screen here. And basically, you will be underlining the words, phrases, or sentences that stand out to you, drawing a box around any unfamiliar words or phrases that you see, and writing down any reactions, opinions, or questions that you have about the text in the margins. Before you get started, let me give you an example of what that might look like. So this is a section that I annotated while I was reading the text for the first time. This sentence about Britain's political order being transformed into a democracy stood out to me as being important. I'm going to read the sentence to you now. Britain's old social and political order, which dated back to medieval times, was transformed into a modern democracy. So here, the author is talking about a social and political order that had been around since the medieval times, so many, many years, and that was finally changing into something more modern. That seems like a big deal to me, so I went ahead and underlined it. That part made me think about one of the quotes in the beginning section of the text, in the Voices of the Period section. And that particular quote made by Sir Wilfrid Laurier is shown here, and I underlined some parts of it. I underlined the parts that he said, "We stand astonished," the development of civilization, and then he goes on to explain a little bit about that. So we stand astonished at the advance of culture, of wealth, of legislation, of education, of literature, of the arts and sciences, of locomotion by land and by sea, and of almost every department of human activity. So he's saying here that no matter how familiar a person might be with the facts of what happened in the Victorian era, they would probably be astonished by how much different parts of civilization developed during that time. He goes on to say that these developments spanned areas and affected advances in culture, wealth, legislation, and he goes on to list them there in the part that I underlined. So in the margins of the text, I've made a note about the connection that I saw in my first reading about this sentence in the passage and Laurier's quote, since this is one of the developments that he was talking about. So one of the developments he was talking about was about legislation, of education, and here in the text itself, it says it's talking about the development of Britain's social and political order. And so I made that connection here that it connects to Laurier's quote about being astonished of the development of civilization. So that is just one example of an annotation that you might make during your first reading. Yours will be different, likely, because during this first reading, it's all about underlining what stands out to you, and what stands out to you might be different than what stands out to me. So don't feel the need to make these exact notations in your text, but go ahead and take some time now to do your first reading of those sections in your reading that are listed on your learning packet, the Voices of the Period section and the 3 subsections of the History of the Period section. Pause the video and do that now. So welcome back. You should have finished reading the sections that I assigned to you, and now it's time to do some thinking. So now that you've read, I'd like you to think about 2 questions. And there isn't any space to answer this because these are just thinking questions. So if you need somewhere to write this down, you can write your responses in the margins of the text. The first question you're going to think about is, how does this text relate to the essential question of the unit, which is, what does it mean to call a place home? So we learned about the Victorian era, which lasted for much of the 1800s. During this time, we learned that Great Britain grew its empire, meaning that it colonized many countries. Think about how people living in Britain might have felt about their home, knowing that their country had taken over others around the world. How do you think people living in the countries that were taken over felt? Another thing we read about was war. So we read about Britain, Ireland, Germany, Russia, Japan, and China. How does what you learned about these countries relate to the question of what does it mean to call a place home? Another thing to think about is the growth that countries experienced between 1901 and the present day. During that time, there was a period of industrialization and a rise of democracy. This allowed many people to become successful, but unfortunately, millions were still living in poverty. Inequality generally makes it easier for powerful leaders to rally their followers with the promise of a better life. We saw that a little bit in the text when the text talked about the end of World War I. At the end of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles heavily punished Germany after the World War ended because of the part that Germany played in the war. This ended up fostering resentment and inequality in the country, and many people were unhappy as a result of the treaty. This then became the impetus for World War II. So, given what I've just told you and what you read about in the text, think about this last question here. What do you think would be necessary for the world to see the end of war? Think about both of these questions and jot down your answer in the margins of the text. Now that you've done some thinking and you've written down your responses, it's time to have a discussion. So I'd like you to discuss what you've learned about the British Empire and world history with a family member, friend, or classmate. You can go ahead, pause the video, and have that discussion now. Now that you've talked with someone about what you learned today, you'll move on to your writing task. And for your writing today, your task is to answer two questions. First, why was the Victorian era an age of transition? Second, what do you think would be necessary for the world to see the end of war? So that first question can be answered by thinking about what you learned in the first section of the text. That section was called the Victorian era. So I would recommend you go back to that section, look at what you underlined, and pull out some details there to help you write your response at the top of your note catcher. The second question should look familiar because it's the same one you were thinking about after reading the text. So if you jotted down your answer in the margin, or if you jotted down some notes as you were thinking, then go back to those notes and flesh them out here at the bottom of your note catcher. In our next lesson, we'll finish reading the text and we will talk about how different groups of people may have been affected by historical events. If you have any questions about today's lesson or you need some support, feel free to reach out to your teacher. Their email address format is on the screen here. It's going to be their first name dot last name at detroitk12.org. And I wanted to thank you for learning with me today. And before I let you go, just 3 quick reminders. I really want to make sure that you talk about your lesson with someone and share your learning with them. Make sure that you read for 20 minutes and complete a reading log entry, and that again can be found in the front of your packet. And finally, don't forget to practice your reading fluency using the first or second page of your weekly reading. Thanks again, and I'll see you soon.